The Debt of Blood. Part 1. The Night That Started It. Osan Air Base, South Korea. November 1959. Chuck Norris was 19 years old, and it was 3 in the morning, and he was bleeding from a cut above his left eye that kept sending thin, warm ribbons down the side of his face. He was sitting on the floor of a storeroom he didn't recognize, his back against shelves of tinned goods, and there was a man across from him whom he had never seen before tonight, and who had, in the last 11 minutes, broken 2 other men's arms, dislocated a third man's shoulder, and dragged Chuck out of an alley behind a bar in the town of Osan, where 3 locals had decided that an American airman alone at 2:30 in the morning was a reasonable target. The man's name, Chuck would learn in the days that followed, was Park Sung-jin. He was 54 years old, which made him 35 years Chuck's senior, and he was built like something that had never been young, compact, economical, with hands that looked like they had been cast from different material than the rest of him. He ran a small Tang school in a building 2 streets from the base's main gate, which is why he had been awake at that hour. He had been closing up after a late session and had heard the noise in the alley the way a man trained to hear trouble hears it. Not as sound, but as meaning. He had not hesitated. He had come into that alley and done what he did with a completeness that Chuck would spend years trying to understand. Not the technique of it, though the technique was extraordinary, but the quality of it, the absence of anything unnecessary. No anger, no performance, no wasted movement. 3 men incapacitated in a time Chuck could not accurately measure afterward, because he had been too busy trying not to lose consciousness. In the storeroom, Park Sung-jin handed Chuck a cloth for his eye and sat across from him with the patience of someone who has nowhere pressing to be. "You study martial arts," the old man said, in English that carried the careful precision of someone who has learned a language from books rather than from people. Chuck pressed the cloth to his eye. "A little. I started 3 months ago. Basic stuff." "Why?" The question was simple enough that it deserved a simple answer. Chuck thought about it anyway. "Because I keep ending up in situations like this one," he said, "and I keep not being ready for them." Park Sung-jin looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the same unhurried precision, "Come to my school tomorrow afternoon. I have a shift. After your shift." Chuck went. He trained with Park Sung-jin for the remaining 9 months of his posting at Osan. 3 evenings a week and all day Saturday, in a room that smelled of pine floors and old sweat and something underneath both that Chuck associated forever afterward with the particular silence of genuine concentration. The old man was not a gentle teacher. He was precise and demanding and occasionally alarming in his thoroughness, but he was never unkind, which Chuck understood even at 19 was different from being gentle. On Chuck's last evening, 3 days before he shipped back to California, Park Sung-jin made tea in the back room of the school, and they sat together for a long time without saying anything, which was by that point a comfortable condition between them. Then the old man said, "I have 1 son. He died in 1950. He had 1 son, my grandson, who is now 7 years old and lives in Busan with my wife's sister. His name is Park Jin-soo." Chuck waited. "If something happens," the old man said, "if Jin-soo ever comes to you, you help him." "What would happen?" Chuck said. "I don't know. Things happen." He paused. "I saved your life. I am not asking you to repay that. I am asking you to understand that blood has weight, that when you take something from the world, a man's skill, a man's time, a man's protection, you take on a portion of what he carries. I am asking you to carry a small piece of what I carry." Chuck was 19 years old and had grown up in a house where a man's word was worth more than his wallet, because the wallet was usually empty. He understood oaths at a level that predated analysis. "If Jin-soo comes to me," he said, "I'll help him." The old man nodded once. He poured more tea. They sat until the candle burned low. Chuck flew home 3 days later. He did not see Park Sung-jin again. Part 2. 13 years. The years between 19 and 32 are the years in which a person becomes the permanent version of themselves, whether they intend to or not. Chuck Norris became a karate teacher, a competitor, a champion, a man whose name meant something in specific circles and was gaining weight in wider ones. He opened schools, lost 10 fights, and then won for 6 years straight. Built a life in Torrance, California that bore almost no resemblance to the life he had grown up in, except in the values it ran on: discipline, endurance, the refusal to treat difficulty as a reason to stop. He thought about Park Sung-jin sometimes, not often, but consistently, the way you think about something that altered the fundamental direction of your life without making a noise about it. The alley in Osan had not been a dramatic moment. No one had been watching. There was no crowd, no consequence, no record of it anywhere. Just an old Korean man who had come out of a doorway at the right moment and changed everything downstream. He had made inquiries twice, once through a former Air Force contact who had remained stationed in Korea, once through a Korean-American martial artist he knew in Los Angeles, whose family still had connections in Busan. The first inquiry returned nothing. The second returned a rumor. Park Sung-jin had closed his school in the early 1960s. His wife's sister had moved. The grandson Jin-soo had not been heard from in several years. Chuck filed the information in the place where you file things you cannot act on, not forgetting, not obsessing, just holding. In the spring of 1973, he was 33 years old, and he was at the dojo in Torrance on a Wednesday afternoon running a private lesson with an actor who had recently decided that martial arts would be useful for an upcoming film. The lesson had gone well. The actor had left. Chuck was straightening the equipment room when Paulie, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "There's a kid out front," Paulie said. "Korean kid, young, maybe 2021. Says he knows you." Chuck went to the front door. The young man standing on the sidewalk outside the dojo was thin and not tall, with the kind of face that carries intelligence in the planes of it rather than in any single feature. He was dressed in clothes that had been worn long and washed often, the way the clothes of someone who owns few of them look. He was carrying a small backpack that appeared to contain everything he had. His eyes, when they met Chuck's, had a quality that Chuck recognized, not fear exactly, but its close relative, the particular alertness of someone who has been in a sustained state of danger long enough that normal is no longer a setting they can access. "Mr. Norris," he said, "my name is Park Jin-soo. My grandfather told me to find you." Part 3. What the boy carried. They sat in the dojo office, Chuck in the chair behind the desk, Jin-soo on the edge of the wooden bench along the wall, the backpack at his feet, as though even here he hadn't quite decided to put it down fully. Paulie brought water. Jin-soo drank half of it immediately, which told Chuck something about the last several hours of his journey. The story came out in pieces, the way stories come out from people who are unaccustomed to being listened to. Tentative at first, then faster, the words releasing the way water releases from a container that has been sealed too long. Park Sung-jin had died in February of 1969. Not of illness, not of age. He had been 64 and in the health of a man 20 years younger. He had been killed during a confrontation with men who worked for a man named Kwon Dae-jung, who ran a network of loan operations and enforcement businesses throughout the Gyeonggi province, and who had decided at some point in 1968 that the building in which Park Sung-jin's school operated would be more profitable as something else. The old man had refused to move. This was, Jin-soo said quietly, exactly what anyone who knew his grandfather would have expected. Kwon Dae-jung's people had come 3 times. 3 times Park Sung-jin had declined to vacate. The 3rd time, 2 men had come into the school during an evening class, in front of 8 students, and beaten the old man with iron bars. He had died 4 days later in a hospital in Seoul. There were no arrests. Kwon Dae-jung had arrangements with the local police apparatus that functioned as a substitute for accountability. Jin-soo had been 16 when his grandfather died. He had spent the next 4 years in Busan, working in the shipyards, sending money to his grandfather's wife, his great-aunt, who had been a mother to him in the years after his own parents were gone. He had stayed out of Kwon's reach because Kwon had no reason to notice a 16-year-old shipyard worker who had no property and no leverage. Then, in the winter of 1972, his great-aunt died. She had been 78 and tired, and she left behind a house in a street in Busan that was, by a coincidence so precisely cruel it seemed designed, directly adjacent to a parcel of land that Kwon Dae-jung had recently decided he needed. Kwon's people contacted Jin-soo. They were polite. They offered a price for the house that was approximately 30% of its value, and explained, in language that did not require interpretation, that the offer was not negotiable and had a deadline of 60 days. Jin-soo was 20 years old. He had no lawyer, no money above the 30% offer, no family, and a grandfather's voice in his memory that said, "If you ever need help, there is a man, an American." His name is Chuck Norris. It had taken him 6 months to get the money for the flight. He had arrived in Los Angeles the day before yesterday. He had slept in the airport. He had found the dojo address through a telephone directory in a public library. He finished. The office was quiet. Through the open window came the faint sounds of the street. A car engine, someone's radio, the ordinary noise of the world conducting its business. Chuck looked at the young man on the bench. He was 20 years old, and he had crossed an ocean with a name written on a piece of paper and the faith that the name would be worth something when he got here. Chuck thought about an alley in Osan, about tea and candlelight, about an old man who had said, "Blood has weight." "How long is the deadline?" he said. 31 days from now, Jin-soo said. Chuck nodded. "Okay." Jin-soo looked at him. "Okay, what?" "Okay, we deal with it. Mr. Norris, you don't understand who Kwon Dae-jung is. He has—" "I understand," Chuck said. "I understand that your grandfather asked me for something and I said yes. That doesn't have an expiration date." He stood. "You'll sleep here tonight. There's a cot in the back room. Tomorrow we start figuring out what we're actually dealing with." Part 4. The shape of the problem. He spent 4 days learning everything he could about Kwon Dae-jung. This was not a simple task in 1973 in a Los Angeles dojo. There was no internet, no instant information. What there was instead, a network of Korean-American community contacts. A former military intelligence officer Chuck knew through a mutual training friend, a Korean newspaper archive at UCLA, and Jin-soo himself, who turned out to have a precise and detailed memory for everything he had ever observed or been told, a quality that Chuck recognized as the inheritance of someone raised by an intelligent person who understood that the poor cannot afford not to pay attention. What the research assembled, Kwon Dae-jung was 61 years old, originally from Seoul, self-made in the way that men are self-made when the thing they make themselves from is other people's desperation. He had begun in the 1950s running informal lending operations in war-damaged neighborhoods where the official banking system did not reach and did not particularly want to. He had expanded through the 1960s, enforcement, property acquisition, political relationships maintained through the currency of delivered favors. By 1973, he was a significant figure in the Gyeonggi-Incheon corridor, not a gangster in any cinematic sense, but something more durable and more dangerous, a businessman whose business model included, as a load-bearing structural element, the credible threat of serious violence. He was not known to travel. He managed his operations through 4 or 5 trusted intermediaries whose identities were generally known in the communities where he operated. He had a son, Kwon Min-jae, 32 years old, who was said to be significantly more aggressive in his methods than his father, and who was increasingly the operational face of the enterprise. The Busan property dispute was, in the hierarchy of Kwon's operations, minor. The land adjacent to Jinsu's house was needed for a warehouse that would serve a distribution arrangement. The house itself was an obstacle rather than a prize. In Kwon's operational logic, Jinsu was not an adversary, he was an inconvenience with a deadline. Which means, Chuck said on the fourth evening, sitting across from Jinsu at the dojo's backroom table with papers spread between them, that going to Korea and standing on the property and refusing to move is not going to produce the outcome we want. No, Jinsu said, it will produce an outcome, not a good one. But there's a legal dimension here, Chuck said. The property is legitimately his. Kwon can't acquire it without either purchase or a legal process. What's the legal process? Jinsu looked at the table. In Korea there are courts, and there are men who control what courts do in specific jurisdictions. He paused. The Busan district where the house is located, Kwon has a relationship with the deputy regional administrator, probably also with the presiding judge of the civil court. Chuck absorbed this. So the legal path is compromised. The legal path is a performance. It ends where Kwon decides. Chuck was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, what does Kwon actually need? Not the house, the land, for the warehouse. What does the warehouse do? Distributes goods from the port, legal goods mostly. Busan is a major port city. His distribution network moves legitimate cargo. It also moves other things, but the warehouse itself is for legitimate cargo. So the warehouse needs port access, transport routes, and to not be a problem, Jinsu said. Kwon doesn't want complications. He wants the land. He builds the warehouse. The operation runs smoothly. The house is a complication. He wants it removed. What if, Chuck said slowly, the house were no longer a complication? Not because it's gone, but because it's useful. Jinsu looked at him. If the house becomes part of the operation, if Jinsu becomes someone Kwon needs rather than someone Kwon needs to remove, the equation changes. Chuck folded his hands on the table. I know people in the port logistics business, Korean-American freight operators who work the LA Busan corridor. If I could arrange a connection, if Jinsu had something to offer Kwon rather than just something to resist him with, it changes what Kwon's options are. Jinsu was quiet. His face held the particular expression of someone hearing an idea that conflicts with their existing emotional framework. You want me to work with the man who killed my grandfather. I want you to be alive and in possession of your house in 30 years, Chuck said. Those two things require a specific path. The path involves not going to war with a man who controls courts and police. He looked at Jinsu steadily. Your grandfather kept his school by being immovable, and they killed him for it. I'm not telling you to make peace with what happened. I'm telling you that the way you honor him is by surviving and by having something to pass on. You can't do that from a hospital bed or a cemetery. The silence stretched. Outside the window, the street was going dark, the sodium lamps coming on in their orange succession. What people? Jinsu said finally. What port logistics people? War Party 5. Leverage. The man's name was Tommy Rhee, and he ran a small but reputable freight forwarding operation out of an office near the port of Los Angeles that smelled of cigarettes and strong coffee and the particular anxiety of someone who is always slightly more overextended than he would prefer. Chuck had known Tommy for 3 years through the Korean-American martial arts community in Los Angeles. Tommy had trained briefly at a school where one of Chuck's black belts taught, and they had met at a tournament and maintained the kind of friendship that lives in occasional phone calls and a mutual respect that doesn't require frequent maintenance. Tommy listened to what Chuck laid out, the property situation, the Kwon network, the port connection Kwon needed. What you're asking me, Tommy said carefully, is to introduce a 20-year-old kid with no business to a man who kills people who inconvenience him. I'm asking you to introduce a 20-year-old kid who owns a property adjacent to land Kwon needs to Kwon's legitimate logistics operation as a potential partner for the warehouse access. That's a fine distinction. It's the only distinction that matters, Chuck said. If Jin-soo has nothing to offer, Kwon removes him. If Jin-soo has something Kwon wants, a property arrangement rather than a purchase, a facilitated access rather than a forced takeover, Jin-soo has leverage. Leverage is the only currency that works with people like Kwon. Tommy looked at his cigarette, at Chuck, back at the cigarette. You've thought about this for several days. And if Kwon decides the leverage isn't worth the arrangement, if he decides to just take the property anyway, then we're no worse off than we started, Chuck said. And we've documented the approach attempt, which may have value in different jurisdictions. Different jurisdictions meaning the freight forwarding business runs through international commerce. International commerce has regulators with longer arms than Busan district courts. Tommy looked at him. You're talking about using American regulatory bodies as a backstop threat. I'm talking about Jin-soo having documented options that Kwon would prefer not to activate, Chuck said. I'm talking about making the problem of removing Jin-soo more expensive than the problem of working with him. Tommy stubbed out the cigarette, thought for a moment, then said, I have a contact in Kwon's logistics division. Not Kwon directly, one of his shipping coordinators, a man named Lee who handles the Busan LA freight side. I can make an introduction, a business introduction. That's all it is. That's all it needs to be, Chuck said. Part 6, the weight of it. The meeting with Lee happened on a Thursday morning in a conference room at Tommy Rhee's office. Lee was 60, professional, and entirely unsentimental. A man whose job was to solve problems and who evaluated every conversation for its problem-solving utility. Jin-soo sat across from him and Chuck sat off to the side, not participating, present only as context. Jin-soo laid out the proposal with a precision that told Chuck he had memorized it overnight. Not a sale, but a long-term access agreement. The property would remain in his ownership. Kwon's warehouse would have formalized right-of-way across it, a documented, legal, recorded easement. Jin-soo would be compensated annually. The arrangement would be renewable and subject to renegotiation every 5 years. Lee listened without expression. When Jin-soo finished, Lee said, "What you're describing is a legal instrument." "Yes," Jin-soo said. "Mr. Kwon does not typically. Mr. Kwon's warehouse operation will be documented in American commercial records through Tommy Rhee's freight forwarding company," Jin-soo said. "That means it has American regulatory visibility. A legal property arrangement protects everyone, including Mr. Kwon." The silence that followed this was a particular kind of silence. The silence of someone doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to have to do. Lee said, "I will convey the proposal." He left. Tommy looked at Jin-soo with an expression Chuck read as reluctant admiration. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" Jin-soo was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to say, 'The man who knows what the other man actually wants is never truly powerless.'" He paused. "He also used to say that sometimes you have to put your fear in a box and leave it outside the room." Chuck looked at the young man across the table and felt something that was not quite pride. He had no claim to pride here, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of watching someone become who they were going to be. The feeling of a debt. Not fully paid, but honestly carried. Epilogue, 31 days. Kwon Dae-jung's response came 8 days later, through Lee, through Tommy Rhee, delivered to Jin-soo in the same conference room where the original proposal had been made. The answer was yes. Not enthusiastically, not generously. It was the yes of a man who had evaluated a problem and concluded that the arrangement being offered was marginally preferable to the alternatives, which was the only kind of yes that a man like Kwon Dae-jung ever gave. The easement agreement would be drawn up through a Korean attorney. Jin-soo would retain the property. Annual payments would begin the following year. The warehouse would be built on the adjacent land. The access road would be shared. Jin-soo signed the agreement 4 weeks later in a law office in Busan. The house remained his. The warehouse was built. Kwon got his access road. Jin-soo got a legal instrument that provided him income and, more importantly, an ongoing relationship with a man who now had a financial reason to prefer his continued existence to his absence. It was not justice. Chuck understood that. Jin-soo understood it too, more clearly and more personally. Park Sung-jin had been killed by men in Kwon's operation, and no one had been held responsible, and no legal process was going to change that. The men who had come with iron bars into a school in front of 8 students were alive and operating, and had experienced no consequence. Chuck sat with that knowledge, the way you sit with a wound that has closed but not healed, careful not to press it, aware of its presence, realistic about what it meant. He called Jin-soo on the day the agreement was signed. Jin-soo answered from the law office, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has been running on tension for so long that its sudden reduction hasn't yet registered as relief. "It's done," Jin-soo said. "I know. It's not." He stopped, started again. "It's not what I wanted." "I know," Chuck said. "I wanted someone to pay." "I know." Chuck was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather saved my life because he could, not because he expected anything from it. He made me a promise keeper because he understood that the only way the world gets marginally better is if people keep their promises to each other. He didn't ask me to fix what's broken in it. He asked me to help you stay in it." The line was quiet for a long time. "He would have liked you," Jin-soo said finally. "I liked him," Chuck said. "I only knew him for 9 months, but I think about him more often than people I've known for decades. That's what it means when someone actually teaches you something. They don't leave." He hung up. He stood in his office in the dojo in Torrance, California, where the afternoon light came through the west window in long, warm slats across the wooden floor. Through the door, he could hear the sounds of his 3:30 class, the rhythmic thud of feet, the sharp exhale of controlled effort, the voice of one of his black belts counting cadence. An old Korean man had come out of a doorway 14 years ago and changed the direction of everything. He had asked for one thing in return, that the weight of it be carried forward, not put down, not converted into clean ledger entries, carried. The way you carry something that belongs to you, that has your name on it, that goes where you go. Chuck picked up the phone again. He called his mother in Torrance because she answered on the second ring and always would, and because some debts are never discharged and don't need to be, they just need to be honored daily with the small consistent acts of someone who has not forgotten who made them possible. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom," he said. Outside, one of his students laughed at something, a bright, abrupt sound, the laugh of someone young who has just surprised themselves with their own ability. It moved through the dojo walls like a signal of something Chuck couldn't name precisely, but recognized the way you recognize the beginning of a season before it fully arrives. He was 33 years old. He had kept his promise. Blood had weight. He carried it.